And one of the things that we're very excited to have, and I think there's some handouts outside, is just yesterday, Representative John Conyers' office announced that they had collected 104 signatures of members of the House of Representatives on a letter to Susan Rice, who's the U.S. ambassador to the UN, urging her to make sure that the UN lives up to its own standards in responding to cholera. Thank you.
Well, this, by the way, is the letter with many beautiful signatures, a collection of Congress's calligraphy. And it's a Democratic letter. I take it there may well be a Republican letter in the works. And that's something certainly that the UN, since it depends upon the Congress for its funding, the U.S. typically gives about 20% of the UN budget, and in peacekeeping it gives even more. Plus we give our logistics. You can't go anywhere around the globe without our tip FIDs, our time-phased deployment plans, and our lift capability left over from the Cold War. So we are very essential to the UN's ability to deploy worldwide, and therefore I hope that for that, among other reasons, they'll take us seriously. You would think that, of course, indeed, peacekeeping, like any other UN activity, should first be bound by the Hippocratic, not the hypocritical, but the Hippocratic oath, first do no harm. And therefore one worries that if, whether it's because of bureaucratic processes or self-regard, there's not the kind of feedback loop that every organization needs. John Hopkins needs it. The U.S. Army has a lessons learned at Fort Leavenworth, which after every operation scrubs it, says what went right, what went wrong. The Israelis have tried to do this now. It's any organization needs a way of examining itself self-critically without seeing it as embarrassing or disgraceful, but rather just the learning organization, if you will. And now a few things about the situation here. I may differ slightly from Brian, because I'm not the plaintiff. I don't care who's at fault. It has to be fixed. And what lawyers sometimes do is to go into a situation and say, defendant, we're not asking you to say nothing. Just fix it. If you'll give $200 million to fix the Haitian water system out of your $800 million peacekeeping budget, then you can privately go about fixing the bureaucratic processes that led to this. But first and foremost, I'm not a bureaucratic theoretician. Fix it. And that, I think, is something that's more congenial politically for proud countries, that they don't have to beat their chests publicly to admit fault, but just damn fix it. So I'm different for you. I just want the money, honey, and the fix. But a couple of things, because I have followed the UN and kind of with a tough love for about 20 years now. And the more you live with them, it's like a spouse. The more you live with them, the more things you see to improve. So let me just say a couple of these things. One is that there's almost a kind of a boring cycle at the UN where something disastrous happens, and they write a very long report, and they beat their chests, and they spend a lot of money and get very smart people to say lessons. This is what went wrong in Rwanda. This is what went wrong in Srebrenica. Never again. And they put it in the file drawer, and oftentimes it just does not get embedded in the ROEs or the decision making that should look to the future with anticipation. So I'm really rather tired. I sign them in class sometimes, even though they're very long, but I'm rather tired of reading them. And therefore, it's just not an adequate way of dealing with this, to have a 10-year after-the-fact lamentation. I really would like the process to be fixed while there is mitigation of damages. Secondly, there's a debate going on about the epidemiology, the etiology of the cholera. The UN doesn't have to be the sole cause for there to be causality in traditional common law tort doctrine. You can have several causes. You can apportion blame and liability. But if you do indeed have this proximate event where there was an observation of a bad water system, and bada bing, a couple of weeks, days later, you have cholera breaking out, I think most juries downtown here would take the point that there's probably some connection. So all the highly refined he said, she said's of debate on the epidemiology, I think is going to have it's going to be rather fruitless in the sense of if the purpose of it is to deny any UN responsibility. Third thing, in class yesterday, in last session of my public international law class, we looked at the draft articles on the responsibility of international organizations, which has just been finished by the UN International Law Commission in Geneva. And Article 35, 36, and 37 says that there has to be restitution, compensation, and satisfaction if an international organization is responsible for any internationally wrongful act. So this is not just neighborly goodwill. It's not a treaty, but it's a statement by the International Law Commission, which is other than the Court of Justice, the highest, most authoritative restatement of kind of international common law by the UN in Geneva, and it just came off the presses, and it's been adopted. So, council cites council, if you will, or the UN has to should read its own report. A couple more quick points. I very much take Brian's point on board that the peacekeeping operations division really has to spend much more time in prophylaxis, looking at medical jackets, having immediate pre-deployment testing. In the old days when I was in New York in the 90s, they didn't get medical jackets. So they didn't know if somebody was, the contingent was 99% or 65% or 22% HIV positive, and couldn't make decisions on how to use troops based upon that. It should be routine standard practice to demand. And if they don't want to do it, get a different contingent. Because peacekeeping is a cash cow. I hate to put it that way. But for poor countries, you make $1,100 a month per guy, and you get equipment rental. So for poor countries that want to have militaries, peacekeeping, in fact, is a very handy source of hard currency. So there are countries that want to do this. So one has some bargaining leverage to say, if you want to keep sending contingents, please bring the medical jackets. Secondly, the Security Council and the UN is bound by human rights law. The Charter itself presumes that the UN will comply with international law. Even the Security Council, which has peremptory authority, is supposed to abide by international law. And they're scared of claims. They have never really, in fact, figured out a way to forthrightly deal with issues that arose from Rwanda when various contingents abandoned their posts and their protected persons were killed. They've always been afraid that the numbers were too high. And one story I heard from the inside recently was from one of my sources and methods. Pays to have friends. Everyone, even the UN needs friends. That the Peacekeeping Operations Department is terrified of this, because if it was costed out in full, it could cost hundreds of millions of dollars that they feel that they don't have. And frankly, here we may differ. While I want satisfaction for the victims, I think the first and foremost remedy that's needed is to prevent it from happening again and to curb the epidemic now that is endemic to Haiti. Because once you have this kind of cholera in the country, you can't get rid of it. Every rainy season, the basilisk comes up from the soil. And finally, let me just say one more thing, which is, well, two more things. One is just, I had friends who were in Haiti who died in the earthquake. And in a sense, the UN building collapsed. And in a sense, it's unfaithful and disrespectful to forget the Haitians for just a moment. Though they are the major people whose souls are at stake here. But the UN people, too. They died in Haiti for a mission. And I'm sure they would be horrified, so to say. Their heirs would be horrified to suppose that what they died for has now turned in such a fashion to be destructive. And finally, let me just read Article 37 from these same International Law Commission Rules of Responsibility for International Organizations. It says satisfaction must be made for an injury caused by A, compensation, acknowledgement, formal apology. But 37.3 curiously says, satisfaction may not take a form humiliating to the responsible international organization. Well, ladies and gentlemen, what's humiliating is not doing anything. So I do think that despite the slightly CYA quality of 37.3, that they ought not to be humiliated in the course of giving satisfaction. The best thing they can do to avoid humiliation is step up to the plate and figure this out. And the other thing about the UN, which is very frustrating if you try to really do things with them, it's a who's on first. It's never clear who's really responsible for making something happen. Is it the Peacekeeping Operations Department? Is it the Department of Political Affairs? Is it the Secretary General's office? Who do you know in each department? Do they talk to each other? Will the GA put up the money? Will the countries that have more large donors put up the money? It requires leadership to do this. And frankly, it ought to come from Ban Ki-moon. It ought to come from the U.S. mission. I'm glad some of it came from Bill Clinton. It ought to come from the White House. It ought to come from Susan Rice. And the kind of sort of torpor, which often just reporting buck-slip 4-year comment awaiting events, which is too often the culture because nobody in particular is responsible, has to, in this case, obviously be avoided and remedied. There's a new Deputy Secretary General, Jan Eliasson from Sweden, who was head of OCHA for at least a couple of years, who put the Human Rights Council in place. It's a perfect task for a Deputy Secretary General with a background in humanitarian affairs. It's something peacekeeping should do. It's something the U.S. Undersecretaries General, there's a new U.S. Undersecretary General for Political Affairs, they should do. It's something the mission should do. And it should be, frankly, the issue of the election. It's something that Barack Obama should do. So I'm very, very glad that folks have been doing this. It was something I was completely unaware of until I got called up by a journalist. It's manageable enough. It will not cost billions of dollars to fix this. It will cost $200 million, which in UN budgets is nothing.